There is a rule every merchant captain learns before they're ever trusted with a ship of their own. If a wreck hasn't been salvaged in 300 years, there's usually a reason nobody wants to say out loud. The Kessler Drift is full of those wrecks, a slow, silent river of dead hulls looping around a burnt-out star, cold enough to freeze breath, old enough that most of the ships out there predate half the governments currently claiming this stretch of space. Nobody patrols it. Nobody salvages it. And for 300 years, absolutely nobody has gotten close enough to the largest hulk in that drift to notice one very small, very important detail. It isn't dead. It never was. Somewhere in that frozen graveyard, a single human warship has been sitting in the dark for 3 centuries, fully crewed, fully armed, still running the last order it was ever given, and that order was never rescinded. Nobody told it the war ended. Nobody told its crew they could finally go home. And when a routine salvage run finally drifted close enough to wake it up, what happened next didn't just end one very bad day for one very unlucky trade convoy. It cracked open a secret 3 governments had spent 300 years quietly agreeing to forget. And by the time you reach the end of this one, you'll understand exactly why some soldiers don't need new orders to keep fighting. They just need someone to finally believe they were never told to stop. The Kessler Drift had a reputation long before Mayra Okonkwo ever flew into it, and every version of that reputation agreed on exactly one thing. Nothing out there was worth the risk. She'd heard the stories the same as every other junior pilot working the aphelion trading, concerns outer routes. Old spacer talk about a graveyard of derelicts looping a dead star nobody had bothered naming. Wreckage from a war so old the governments who'd fought it didn't even use the same star charts anymore. Salvage crews who went in came back with nothing, or didn't come back at all, and the ones who did make it out swore up and down that something in there still had power, still had eyes, still didn't want visitors. Myra had always assumed that was exactly what it sounded like, spacer superstition. The kind that grew thicker the further you got from any properly charted lane. Superstition didn't usually come with its own gravitational survey data, though, and when her hauler's long-range scanner returned a mass reading 4 times larger than anything else drifting in that field, superstition stopped being the most interesting explanation available. "That can't be right," she muttered, running the scan again. Her co-pilot, a weathered Varan named Dask who'd flown the outer routes for longer than Myra had been alive, leaned over to check the readout himself and went very quiet. "Recalibrate it," he said. She recalibrated it. The reading held. Something in that drift was roughly the size of a capital-class warship, and it was sitting exactly where every derelict registry the concern maintained insisted there was nothing but scattered debris. "It's probably just density clumping," Dask said, though his voice didn't carry much conviction. "Ice and metal fragments packed tight enough to read heavy on a rough pass. Happens out here more than people think." "And if it's not?" Dask was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the slow, silent drift of wreckage sliding past the viewport, hulls tumbling end over end in the dark with the particular stillness of things that had been dead for a very, very long time. "Then we log the coordinates, we report it to the concerned survey office, and we let somebody with a proper contract and proper insurance go take a look," he said. "We are not paid enough to find out what's actually out there ourselves." Myra logged the coordinates. She reported them to the survey office exactly as instructed. And then, because she was 24 years old and had never once in her short career successfully resisted the pull of a genuine mystery, she also filed a formal request to be assigned to whatever follow-up mission the survey office eventually approved. It took the concern's bureaucracy 6 weeks to authorize a proper survey run, which was, by the standards of a company that measured most decisions in fiscal quarters, remarkably fast. Myra suspected the anomaly's sheer size had rattled someone in the actuarial department badly enough to cut through the usual red tape. Whatever the reason, she found herself 3 months later aboard a dedicated survey vessel. The concern's own science officers crowded into the cramped scanning bay, watching the same mass reading resolve, slowly, into something considerably more specific than density clumping. "That's a hull," said Dr. Yevin Kaz, the survey's lead structural analyst, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone trying very hard not to sound as unsettled as she felt. "That's an intact hull, and it is enormous." "Less." The vessel that emerged from the sensor haze over the following hour was unlike anything in the concern's derelict registry, unlike anything in any registry Kaz could immediately place. Long, brutally angular, built with a functional ugliness that suggested its designers had cared considerably more about survival than elegance. Its hull, streaked with 3 centuries of accumulated ice and dust, still bore markings along its flank, alphanumeric strings, warning labels, and in letters taller than a person, a name none of the survey team could translate. "Power signature," Myra said, watching her own console with a growing unease she couldn't quite name. "It's reading active, low but active." Kaz looked up sharply. "That's not possible. Nothing survives 300 years of exposure with power reserves intact." "I'm not telling you what's possible," Myra said. "I'm telling you what the scanner says." The survey team spent the better part of 2 days cataloging the wreck from a cautious distance before anyone worked up the nerve to suggest a closer pass. And it was during that same 48 hours that the first genuinely strange readings began to accumulate. Emergency lighting, cataloged as dormant on the initial scan, registered a faint but unmistakable increase in output. A communications array, listed in every prior survey as destroyed, showed intermittent signs of residual charge. Something in that hull was not simply surviving. It was, slowly and almost imperceptibly, waking up. "We need to report this up the chain before we go any closer," Kaz said, staring at the accumulating data with an expression that had shifted over 2 days from scientific curiosity into something closer to genuine alarm. "This isn't a salvage find anymore. This is a first contact protocol situation, and none of us are trained for that." There was a moment, on the second day of the closer survey pass, when the entire mission very nearly ended before it properly began. A junior scanning technician, eager to get a cleaner read on the hull's internal structure, angled the survey vessel's active targeting sensor directly at the derelict's hull for a fraction of a second longer than passive protocol allowed. A small, almost reflexive mistake, the kind made 100 times a day on 100 routine surveys without any consequence at all. This was not a routine survey. Within seconds, every dormant sensor array on that ancient hull flared instantly to full, focused alertness, and the survey vessel's own defensive systems screamed a proximity warning as something deep inside the wreck began charging weapons capacitors that had sat cold and silent for 300 years. "Cut the active scan! Cut it now!" Kaz shouted, lunging across the console to kill the offending sensor herself. The charge stopped building the instant the active targeting ceased, the derelict's weapons settling back into a low, watchful idle rather than continuing toward a full discharge. Nobody on the survey vessel spoke for a long moment afterward, the reality of what had almost happened settling slowly over the cramped scanning bay. "It wasn't a malfunction," Myra said quietly, staring at the residual power curve still bleeding down on her display. It reacted, instantly, like it was waiting for exactly that kind of provocation the entire time. Kaz didn't argue with her. She simply reached over and locked out active scanning entirely for the remainder of the survey, and nobody aboard that vessel needed to be told twice why. The report went up the chain that same night. What came back less than 12 hours later surprised everyone aboard the survey vessel far more than the wreck itself had. The Concordat's Deep Space Oversight Authority didn't just acknowledge the report. They flagged it as a Priority 1 historical anomaly and dispatched, within the day, a joint delegation that included not just Concordat military observers, but representatives from two neighboring governments Myra had never expected to see cooperating on anything. Let alone a derelict salvage site, three governments had apparently spent 300 years quietly agreeing not to investigate. The debate that produced that joint delegation had lasted barely 4 hours, remarkably fast for a decision spanning three separate governments, and it split, from the very first session, along lines that would prove uncomfortably familiar in the weeks to come. One faction argued for an immediate, overwhelming military response, a fleet dispatched not to make contact, but to neutralize whatever threat the ancient signal represented before it could act on its own. Another argued for total avoidance entirely, sealing the coordinates permanently and quietly adding the entire drift to the same catalog of places three governments had simply agreed, generations ago, not to look at too closely. It was a junior oversight officer, one nobody in that room expected to carry any real weight, who finally shifted the balance. We built our entire relationship with the unknown on convenient assumption, she said. We assumed extinction because extinction was easier to plan around. If we're wrong about that assumption, sending a war fleet to a signal we don't actually understand is exactly how a mistake becomes a massacre. Send someone capable of asking a question first. It was not in a room still trembling with 3 centuries of inherited fear, a popular position, but it carried, in the end, by a margin narrow enough that the recorded vote would later be studied in political science curricula across a dozen worlds. Why does everyone already know what this is? Myra asked Kaz, watching the delegation's transport dock alongside their survey vessel with a level of urgency that felt wildly disproportionate to a wreck nobody had bothered to name. Kaz didn't answer immediately. When she finally did, her voice had lost whatever remained of its earlier scientific detachment. I don't think they know what it is, she said. I think they know what it might be, and they're terrified of being right. The delegation's senior officer, a severe, silver-haired Concordat admiral named Torvin Reyes, wasted no time on pleasantries once he'd boarded. He gathered the survey team in the science vessel's cramped briefing room, pulled up the same hull imagery Kaz had spent 2 days analyzing, and asked a single question that made the entire room go quiet. Has anyone attempted communication? No, Admiral, Kaz said. We flagged the power readings and reported up the chain immediately per protocol. Reyes exhaled slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing, though not by much. Good, he said, because if that hull is what our historical archive suggests it might be, then whoever attempts contact first is about to have a conversation that could either end very well or end an entire fleet's worth of very badly, depending on how carefully it's handled. What does the archive suggest, Admiral? Myra asked before she could stop herself. Reyes looked at her for a long moment, weighing, she suspected, how much a junior hauler pilot with no clearance actually needed to know. Whatever calculation he ran, It apparently came out in her favor because he answered anyway. 300 years ago, he said, a species we now call the Terrans fought a war against an alliance of 3 founding governments in this sector. That war ended officially in total human defeat, a surrender so complete that every human colony, every human fleet, every scrap of human infrastructure was either destroyed or absorbed within a single generation. He nodded toward the hull imagery still glowing on the display. Officially. That ship's registry markings, assuming our translation matrices are correct, identify it as a vessel of the Terran Defense Fleet, which means either our translation is wrong or 300 years of official history is. Nobody in that briefing room had an answer for that. The silence stretched long enough that Myra found herself staring at the hull imagery, at the scattering of stars etched faintly beside its identifying markings, and feeling the particular vertigo of standing at the edge of something considerably larger than a routine salvage anomaly. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "Now," Reyes said, "we find out very carefully whether that ship is a grave, a relic, or something considerably more dangerous than either. And we do it without giving whatever's inside a single reason to think we're a threat. Because if it's what I fear it might be, it has spent 300 years being told by absolutely no one that it's allowed to stop." The first attempt at contact came 2 days later, conducted with a level of caution that bordered on the theatrical. Admiral Reyes insisted on transmitting from an unarmed shuttle. Alone, broadcasting on every open frequency, the joint delegation's engineers could reconstruct from the oldest archived Terran communication protocols they possessed. For 6 hours, the shuttle drifted at a careful, non-threatening distance from the derelict's hull, transmitting the same simple hail on a loop, receiving nothing in return but silence. It was on the 7th hour, just as Reyes was preparing to abandon the attempt for the day, that the silence finally broke. The voice that came through was distorted, translated in real time by systems working overtime to parse a language nobody had actively spoken in 3 centuries, forced to guess at grammar structures long since fallen out of any living use. But underneath the distortion, it was unmistakably, impossibly human, clipped, exhausted, carrying the particular weight of someone who had said the exact same words more times than they cared to count, and fully expected this time to finally have to act on them. Unidentified vessel. You are inside a restricted defense perimeter. Identify yourself or be fired upon. Reyes went very. Still in the shuttle's cramped cockpit, his hand hovering over the transmit control. Beside him, his young communications officer, a nervous ensign named Priya Dutta, looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "Admiral," she whispered, that's a person, that's an actual living person." "I know," Reyes said quietly. He keyed the transmit control with hands that were, Dutta would later admit in her own report, visibly unsteady. "This is Admiral Torvin Reyes of the Concordat Deep Space Oversight Authority, representing a joint delegation of the sector's governing bodies. We mean no hostile intent. We request permission to open formal communications." The pause that followed stretched long enough that Reyes began to genuinely fear he'd already made some catastrophic diplomatic error. When the voice finally returned, it carried something new underneath its exhaustion, confusion, and beneath that, a wariness sharp enough to cut. "Concordat," the voice repeated. "Unfamiliar designation. State your relationship to the Threll Ascendancy." Reyes glanced at Dutta. Neither of them recognized the name. Whatever the Threll Ascendancy had once been, it wasn't in any history currently taught in any school across the sector. I don't know that designation, Reyes admitted carefully. I think you should know how long you've been out here. The silence that followed was the longest yet, and somewhere inside it, Reyes understood, with the particular clarity of a man realizing he has just become responsible for something far larger than himself, that he was not merely making first contact with a derelict warship. He was about to tell whoever remained aboard it that everything they had ever known was gone. Fleet Commander Danica Voss had not slept properly in nearly a decade of subjective time, which was, by the standards of the long patrol's rotation schedule, nothing unusual at all. She stood at the center of the TDS Perseverance's cramped bridge. The low, familiar hum of systems running 3 centuries past their intended service life vibrating faintly through the deck plating beneath her boots, studying a tactical display that had just shown her something her instruments insisted was impossible. An alien vessel, unlike anything in the directorates. No, she corrected herself, unlike anything in any known order of battle, hailing her with a designation she had never once encountered in 300 years of patrol logs, and a diplomatic tone that sounded almost rehearsed, as though they expected her to be dangerous. Good, she thought grimly, they should. The being on the view screen was nothing like the Threll she remembered from the war's final desperate years, silver-haired, calm in a way that read as genuinely diplomatic rather than merely disciplined, flanked by officers wearing insignia she didn't recognize, standing in a shuttle interior that carried technology decades, possibly centuries, beyond anything the Perseverance still had access to. Admiral Reyes, Voss said, matching his careful tone with one of her own. You said you'd tell me how long I've been out here. I'm listening. Reyes's expression, if Voss was reading an alien species' subtle cues correctly at all, softened into something that looked uncomfortably like pity, and she hated it immediately. Commander Voss, the conflict you remember, what your records likely call the Sector Wars, ended approximately 304 years ago by our best calculation against your ship's own chronometer. The bridge went utterly silent. Somewhere behind Voss, she heard her tactical officer's sharp intake of breath, the soft, involuntary scrape of a boot shifting weight against the deck. 304 years. That could not be correct. Her last clear memory before the final cryo-rotation was the withdrawal from the Corvine salient, the standing order from what remained of fleet command to hold position at the edge of contested space and await further instruction. She had woken from that rotation 6 times since. Each time, the same silence across every channel, the same absence of a recall order. She had assumed, every single time, that the war was simply still going badly somewhere beyond her ability to observe. That command was occupied elsewhere. That someone, somewhere, still needed the perseverance to hold this exact line. That's not possible, she said aloud, and hated how thin her own voice sounded in her ears. The Terran Defense Fleet no longer exists in any form our records can identify, Reyes said gently. Commander, I understand this is. You don't understand anything. The words came out sharper than she intended, 3 centuries of training snapping back into place like a shield raised on pure reflex. You're telling me my chain of command is gone. My homeworld, do you have anything on Earth? Anything at all? A pause, and this time it was Dutta who answered more carefully. Coordinates historically associated Y. The system you're describing were sealed by treaty at the war's end, Commander. No survey has been authorized in 3 centuries. We have no current data. Sealed, not destroyed. Sealed. Voss turned that word over like a stone with something sharp hidden underneath it. It meant something, that particular choice. It meant someone somewhere had decided Earth was dangerous enough or important enough to lock away entirely rather than simply erase. She looked around her bridge at Lieutenant Aris Cade, barely 27 years old by the ship's own chronometer, who had never once known a version of the universe where the war was already over. At Sergeant Ileana Marsh, whose grandmother had died in cryo 2 rotations earlier, still believing she would wake to a victory parade rather than an empty universe. At every soul aboard the Perseverance who had spent their entire lives, some of them their entire lives, full stop, inside 3 centuries of a war that had ended before any of them were even born. "Commander," Reyes said carefully, "I don't know what to offer you except the truth and time to process it. But I need to ask, are your weapons still hostile toward anyone who approaches?" Voss looked at the tactical display, at the alien shuttle that had not fired, had not fled, had simply told her the truth, even though the truth clearly cost something to deliver. "Stand down targeting," she said quietly, and felt the words land in her chest like a door closing on a room she'd lived in for 300 years. "Stand down, all of it." There was a heartbeat of hesitation across the bridge before the order was obeyed. And in that single, suspended moment, Voss felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in decades of subjective time. Not relief, not yet, but the sudden, vertiginous absence of a weight she had never once known she was carrying, because she had never once known what it felt like not to carry it. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Perseverance was no longer at war. She just didn't know yet what she was supposed to be instead. They gave her 3 days before the formal questions began, and Voss spent every hour of them in the ship's archive, forcing herself to rebuild the full shape of what her crew had actually survived without her ever fully understanding it. The Perseverance ran on a rotation doctrine devised in the war's final, desperate years, a brutal compromise between military necessity and simple human cruelty. With no relief fleet coming and no safe harbor left to return to, what remained of Fleet Command had authorized an unprecedented standing order. Staggered cryogenic rotation, indefinite duration, crews cycling continuously through active duty and stasis in overlapping shifts. So the ship was never fully unmanned and never fully awake at once. A skeleton crew of 38, drawn from an original complement well over 200, keeping the reactor idling, the sensors active, the weapons charged, generation after generation, waiting for a recall signal Voss now understood with a clarity that felt like grief would never actually come. She pulled up personnel files and watched her crew's entire hidden history unfold in front of her, piece by devastating piece. Marsh's grandmother, Petty Officer Second Class Dina Marsh, had entered cryo 41 years into the patrol and never woken again, her rotation slot lost to a stasis pod malfunction nobody discovered, until the unit was finally opened for a routine SEAL inspection. Cade's parents had both served aboard, had married in the ship's cramped observation lounge during a joint waking cycle, had raised him in the 14 months allotted between rotations before returning to cryo themselves, entrusting him to whichever crew happened to be conscious at the time. An entire childhood spent being raised in fragmented shifts by whoever the rotation schedule put on duty that particular month. Marsh found the entry about her own grandmother on her 3rd night working the archive alongside Voss, a single line in a stasis maintenance log, dated, time-stamped, utterly clinical. Pod integrity failure, occupant deceased, cause, prolonged system degradation undetected during routine cycle. No ceremony had ever been held. No family had ever formally been told, because there had been no one left conscious at the time who remembered Dina Marsh well enough to properly grieve her, and the ship's own protocols had simply logged the loss and moved forward, the way they had logged every loss for 300 years, because stopping to grieve properly had never once been a luxury the long patrol could afford. She died alone in the dark, doing exactly what she was told to do for a war that had already ended without anyone bothering to tell her, Marsh said quietly, staring at the entry. And nobody even stopped long enough to mark it. She looked at Voss. I don't want revenge for that, Commander. I don't want an apology or anything the histories would eventually call closure. I just want it written down properly, somewhere, so that it wasn't for nothing. So somebody besides me finally knows her name. Voss had the full memorial record compiled over the following weeks, 162 names, cross-referenced against every scrap of personal history the archive could reconstruct, formatted not as a simple casualty list, but as something closer to a family tree, generations of Terran officers who had lived and died entirely within the hum of a single ship's corridors. She had it engraved, eventually, on a plaque mounted just outside the bridge, and made it standing policy that every new crew member, human or otherwise, read every single name aloud during their very first watch aboard the Perseverance. This was not simply a crew. It was a lineage, a closed, self-perpetuating ecosystem of duty and inherited sacrifice that had calcified over 3 centuries into something bordering on religious conviction. The long patrol, the ship's logs called it, capitalized like a proper doctrine. We hold the line until relieved. We hold the line until command says otherwise. We do not go silent, because silence is how a species disappears without anyone ever noticing. Voss had inherited command 11 years into her own rotation cycle, promoted after her predecessor's stasis pod suffered a catastrophic failure during the ship's 33rd waking. She remembered, with painful clarity, standing alone on the observation deck the night she took the command chair, staring out at unfamiliar stars and making herself a single, absolute promise. She would not be the commander who broke faith with the standing order. She would not be the one who decided, unilaterally, that 3 centuries of accumulated sacrifice had been for nothing. Now an alien admiral with genuinely kind eyes was telling her that faith had already been broken a very long time ago, by people who had simply never bothered to tell them. "You're angry," Reyes said, on the second day, having insisted on coming aboard the Perseverance alone and entirely unarmed. A gesture Voss suspected was either extraordinary personal courage or extraordinary confidence in his own government's ability to retaliate decisively if things went badly wrong. "I'm doing the math," Voss said, not looking up from the archive terminal. 38 active crew remaining, 9 full rotations of cryo casualties, 162 souls who never woke up again, who died in stasis holding a line that had stopped existing before their pods even finished sealing. She finally looked at him directly. "I need you to understand something about my people, Admiral. We don't do this because we're stubborn. We do this because it is the only structure any of us have ever known. Take away the long patrol, and you are not liberating my crew. You are leaving them with absolutely nothing left to stand on." Reyes was quiet for a long moment, choosing his next words with obvious, deliberate care. "Then perhaps the answer isn't to take the structure away entirely," he said finally. "Perhaps it's to give it something worth standing for again." Voss almost laughed, a short, bitter sound with no real humor in it. "I don't know yet," Reyes admitted. "But, Commander, your crew held a line for 300 years without orders, without relief, without even knowing whether anyone in the galaxy remembered you existed at all. My government is currently arguing about whether that makes you a threat or something closer to a miracle. I would very much like to help make sure they land on the correct answer." Voss turned back to the archive, to the long, silent list of names who had never once woken up, and made a second promise, quieter than the first but every bit as absolute. Whatever came next, it would mean something. She would not let their 3 centuries of waiting be for nothing. There was a night during that same first week when the fragile peace nearly unraveled entirely from within, rather than from anything Reyes' government did or failed to do. Ensign Corin Ash, one of the youngest crew members ever revived from the deepest rotation cycle, had entered cryo fully expecting to wake to either total victory or total defeat. Anything, really, except a diplomatic delegation and an alien admiral who spoke with something that sounded uncomfortably like sympathy. Convinced the entire encounter was an elaborate Threll infiltration tactic, designed to lull the Perseverance into standing down before an invasion. He attempted to seize the secondary weapons console during a brief window when Voss had stepped away from the bridge. He got as far as the arming sequence before Sergeant Marsh, who had been quietly watching him for the better part of an hour with the particular patience of someone who had grown up reading exhaustion and grief in every face aboard this ship, put a steady hand on his shoulder and talked him. Back from the console, using nothing but her voice. "You want to fire on an unarmed diplomatic vessel that hasn't so much as raised a shield in 3 days," she said, not unkindly. "That's not the Long Patrol, Corin. That's fear wearing the Long Patrol's uniform because it doesn't know how else to survive right now." She didn't report the incident to Voss until 2 full days later, and when she finally did, Voss chose not to discipline him formally. She simply reassigned him to the archive detail, working alongside Marsh, reading through the same 3 centuries of accumulated silence that had very nearly broken him, until he came to understand it the way Marsh herself had slowly begun to. The cultural gap between the 2 crews proved almost as difficult to bridge as the political one, and it surfaced hardest during the joint tactical exercises Reyes arranged, over considerable objection from his own oversight authority, as a genuine gesture of good faith. Concordat military doctrine, Voss learned quickly, had been built across 3 centuries of relatively stable, uncontested peace, rigid command hierarchies, extensively pre-planned engagement protocols, an almost superstitious deference to established procedure that had simply never once been tested by a genuinely adaptive enemy. Her own officers, by brutal contrast, had trained in a doctrine forged entirely by desperation and total war, improvising constantly, reworking tactics mid-engagement, cannibalizing damaged systems to reinforce whatever remained critical, treating every plan as nothing more than a starting point rather than a fixed script to be followed regardless of circumstance. During one joint simulation meant to test coordinated defense scenarios, Lieutenant Cade, 3rd-generation Long Patrol crew, raised entirely within the ship's corridors, took one look at the Concordat fleet's carefully symmetrical formation, and routed half the Perseverance's simulated squadron into an asymmetric flanking pattern that violated no fewer than 4 separate points of standard Concordat engagement protocol. It also won the exercise in under 7 minutes, a result that generated exactly as much alarm among the observing officers as it did grudging admiration. "You cannot simply abandon the formation," the Concordat's tactical liaison, a methodical officer named Haven Das, said afterward, visibly rattled by what he just witnessed. "The formation exists for a reason: coordination, predictability, safety." "With respect, sir," Cade said, still riding the adrenaline of the win. The formation exists because nobody's actually fired on your fleet in 300 years. Predictability is a luxury, Lieutenant Das. We never once had that luxury. Das opened his mouth to argue further, then stopped himself entirely, glancing instead at the tactical replay still glowing on the display behind them. 7 minutes. A clean and total rout, a result his own meticulously drilled doctrine had never once produced against a comparably sized simulated force. Whatever he had intended to say next, he clearly thought better of it. "Walk me through it again," he said instead, quieter this time. "Slowly. I want to understand exactly why it worked before I decide whether I'm even allowed to be frustrated by it." Voss watched the exchange from the observation deck beside Ray's, and something in her chest eased slightly, for the first time since the shuttle had first hailed her ship. "Your people are frightened of us," she said quietly. "Because we never once learned to be comfortable," Voss answered. "And I think," she added, watching Cade explain the flanking maneuver with the animated confidence of someone who had never once considered failure an option worth planning around. "Comfort is the exact thing this sector is about to discover it can no longer afford." Reyes didn't answer immediately. Later, he would remember that particular conversation as the first moment he genuinely understood what his own government's caution might end up costing everyone. Because 3 systems away, in the dark beyond the sector's mapped patrol lanes, sensor buoys that had gone silent weeks earlier were about to be explained in the worst possible way. The first attack came at an outpost called Farron's Reach, a mining colony on the Concordat's furthest frontier, and it arrived with a weapons signature nobody in the current Concordat military had ever catalogued, because nobody currently serving had been alive the last time it had appeared anywhere in the historical record. Voss recognized it before the analysts had even finished compiling their report. She had watched those exact weapon discharge patterns burn scars into her own ship's hull, plating 300 years earlier. "That's Threll ordnance," she said flatly, staring at the tactical feed relayed directly to the Perseverance's bridge. "Ascendancy energy signature unmistakable." Rays patched in from the Concordat's emergency comm. ND channel went very still. The Threll ascendancy was recorded as collapsed. Internal conflict roughly 180 years ago. There's no current intelligence suggesting. "There wasn't current intelligence suggesting my ship still existed either, Admiral," Voss said. "Empires that go quiet don't always actually go extinct. Sometimes they simply stop being anyone's immediate problem for a while, until they decide to become one again." The Concordat fleet's response, when it finally scrambled, revealed exactly the capability gap Voss had quietly clocked during weeks of joint exercises. 3 centuries of largely uncontested peace had produced a military that was elegant, thoroughly disciplined, and utterly unprepared for an enemy that simply refused to observe any of the conventions it had built its entire doctrine around. The Threll ships, larger and considerably more numerous than anything Voss remembered from the war's final years, clearly rebuilt and modernized during their own long silence, tore through the Concordat's first response wave with a brutal, almost contemptuous efficiency, exploiting the exact predictability Das had defended so confidently only days earlier in simulation. Farron's Reach's distress signal cut out just under 15 minutes after first contact. The emergency session that followed had none of the careful deliberation of the earlier assembly debate over whether to even approach the Perseverance in the first place. A senior delegate stood before a chamber now watching real-time casualty estimates climb past the thousands. And for the first time, voiced the question everyone had suddenly become desperate to hear answered. "Commander Voss," he said, and Reyes noted quietly that this was the first time anyone in that chamber had used her actual rank rather than some vague, uncertain designation. "You fought this enemy. You held a line against it for years before your final withdrawal. What does this sector need to know?" Voss stood in the observation gallery, where Reyes had once argued for her people's continued restraint, and felt something shift in the entire room's attention, fear reorganizing itself in real time. From humanity is the danger into humanity might be the only ones left who remember how to actually survive this. "You need to know the ascendancy doesn't negotiate," she said. "It doesn't retreat when it's losing, and it does not consider civilian casualties a cost worth avoiding under any circumstance. You need to know your current doctrine, the formations, the pre-planned engagement protocols, all of it was built for an enemy that plays by agreed-upon rules. The Threll don't have rules. They have objectives." She let that land fully before continuing. "And you need to know that my crew has spent 300 years training, whether we ever wanted to or not, for exactly this fight." The silence in the chamber this time was not fear of humanity. It was the slow, dawning, deeply uncomfortable recognition of exactly what that same fear had very nearly cost every single person listening. "Commander," the delegate said slowly, "what would you need from this body if we asked the Perseverance to help lead our response?" Voss looked at Reyes, who gave the smallest possible nod, and felt 3 centuries of the long patrol finally point towards something genuinely worth the accumulated weight of it. "Trust," she said, "and every ship you can put into the air, because, delegate, I have already fought this war once before. I do not intend to lose it a second time." The 11 days that followed became, in the retelling that historians would spend decades carefully refining, the moment an entire sector relearned a lesson it had spent 3 centuries quietly forgetting. That desperation, properly and ruthlessly channeled, was a technology every bit as valuable as any weapon. Voss did not wait for the Concordat's cumbersome approval processes to catch up with an unfolding crisis. She requisitioned, with Reyes running diplomatic interference at a speed that would eventually earn him both a formal reprimand and, somewhat contradictorily, a promotion, direct access to Concordat shipyards, and set her remaining crew to work doing exactly what the long patrol had trained 3 centuries of Terran officers to do better than absolutely anyone else still alive. Making broken, outdated things dangerous again. The Perseverance's own aging systems, it turned out, held secrets the Concordat's engineers found genuinely startling, weapon capacitor designs that traded elegance entirely for raw sustained output, shield modulation patterns built to absorb continuous bombardment rather than deflect single precise strikes. Because the war the Perseverance had originally been built for was a war of grinding attrition, not clean, honorable duels. Sergeant Marsh and a team of Concordat engineers spent 4 consecutive sleepless days retrofitting a squadron of frontier defense. Frigates with jury-rigged versions of Terran capacitor arrays, and the resulting power output made the frigate's own original designers visibly, deeply uncomfortable. "This isn't remotely how the system is meant to be used," one horrified engineer told Marsh, watching a modified capacitor bank redline well past its rated safety threshold and hold steady there anyway. "No," Marsh agreed cheerfully. "It's how it's meant to work when the only alternative on the table is dying." Training the Concordat's pilots proved considerably harder than retrofitting their hardware. 3 centuries of ingrained doctrine did not unlearn itself in a single week. But Voss found the fastest available teacher was simply putting officers through simulated Threll engagements and letting the formation-based losses speak entirely for themselves. By the 4th day, Das himself, the tactical liaison who had been so genuinely alarmed by Cade's flanking maneuver only a week earlier, was running his own squadron through deliberately asymmetric drills, chastened into a fast, hungry kind of learning that reminded Voss uncomfortably of her own cadets, decades and an entire war ago. There was a particular moment, on the 5th day, that Voss would remember long after the immediate crisis had finally passed. She had stopped by the simulation deck to observe a training run and found Das sitting alone afterward, staring at a tactical replay of his own squadron's 3rd consecutive simulated defeat, looking less like a decorated senior officer and more like a man confronting the sudden, uncomfortable possibility that everything he had ever been carefully taught to trust might not actually be enough to keep his people alive. "It gets easier," Voss told him, settling into the seat beside him without waiting to be invited. "Does it?" Das asked, not looking up from the display. "You make it sound remarkably simple. Abandon the formation, trust raw instinct over established protocol." "It isn't simple," Voss said. "It's simply necessary, and necessary has a way of teaching people very fast if they're actually willing to be taught." She nodded toward the display. "You lost that simulation because you kept waiting for permission to break the pattern. Real combat will never give you time to wait for anyone's permission. It will simply take the ships that hesitate." Das was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, without waiting for anyone's approval, he reset the simulation and ran it again. And this time, 11 seconds into the engagement, he broke formation entirely on his own initiative and won. The counteroffensive at the system neighboring Farron's reach, when it finally came, was not the clean, textbook engagement the Concordat had spent 3 centuries training for. It was messy, adaptive, and built almost entirely on decisions made in real time by officers who had finally been given explicit permission to abandon the formation. The Perseverance led from the front, not because Voss believed in glory, but because her ship, scarred and outdated as it undeniably was, could absorb punishment the newer Concordat vessels simply couldn't, and she would rather bleed first than watch anyone else's crew do it in her place. 22 minutes into the engagement, a Threll cruiser broke through the Perseverance's forward defensive screen and put a sustained energy lance directly through the ship's secondary shield array. And for nearly 2 full minutes, the bridge lost every readout across 3 separate decks at once. "Damage report," Voss demanded, gripping the command rail as the deck tilted sharply beneath a secondary impact she felt more than heard. "Hull breach decks 4 through 6, Cade called back, his voice tight but steady, 3 centuries of drilled discipline holding under a kind of pressure none of them had ever actually faced outside a simulation chamber. "Casualties currently unknown. Marsh's team is already moving toward the breach." Voss watched the tactical display with a stillness that cost her everything she had left to maintain, forcing herself not to think about the 162 names already sitting in the ship's archive, not to let this become one more entry on that list before the engagement was even finished. "Hold position," she said. "We are the anvil, not the hammer. Let the retrofitted frigates finish the flank." It was Das who finally brought the Concordat squadron around in the maneuver that broke the Threll formation completely, executing the same asymmetric flanking pattern Cade had demonstrated in simulation only days earlier. Except this time with real weapons, fire streaking past his cockpit, and real lives riding entirely on whether the timing held. It held. The Threll flagship's commander, whoever it was, clearly hadn't accounted for an enemy that refused to retreat when every tactical model insisted retreat was the optimal choice, and hadn't accounted either for a Concordat fleet that had, in the span of 11 frantic days, finally learned to fight like it too. When the Threll fleet broke and withdrew 6 hours later, it was not because the Concordat had simply outgunned them. It was because, for the first time in 3 centuries, someone had reminded an entire sector that being unpredictable was never the same thing as being reckless, and that humanity, orphaned, forgotten, and doubted right up until the exact moment it mattered most, had never once stopped being exactly the kind of dangerous a sector in crisis genuinely needed. Aboard the Perseverance, damage control finished pulling the last casualty reports as the raw adrenaline of the engagement finally began to fade. 2 wounded, no dead. Voss allowed herself exactly 1 long, unsteady breath of relief before turning her attention back to the tactical display, watching the Threll retreat vector resolve cleanly into a line pointed back toward whatever now remained of ascendancy space. "They'll regroup," she said quietly to Reyes, who had patched into the command channel the moment the engagement finally ended. "This isn't over, it's a pause." "I know," Reyes said, "but it's a pause we bought together. That matters considerably more than you're currently giving it credit for." Voss didn't answer immediately. She was thinking instead of a child's drawing she'd found buried in a decades-old maintenance log during one of her long nights in the archive. A crude stick-figure family standing beneath something clearly meant to represent a son none of them had ever actually seen, captioned in careful, uneven handwriting with a single word: home. Somewhere in that thought, she found the smallest, most fragile version of genuine hope, and allowed herself to hold onto it for exactly as long as the moment permitted. In the days between that counteroffensive and the formal ceremony that would eventually follow, a discovery surfaced that never made it into the Concordat's public record at all, though it quietly shaped every decision the Perseverance's command staff made for months afterward. Among the disabled Threll vessels recovered from the engagement was a single surviving officer, badly wounded, who spent the better part of a week refusing to speak to anyone at all, until Voss, against the strong advice of nearly everyone around her, went to see him personally. "You're the ghost ship," the officer said, once she'd identified herself, his translated voice carrying something that might have been bitter amusement layered beneath obvious pain. "We picked up fragments of an old recall signal nearly 3 years ago. Command dismissed it entirely as decayed static from a dead frequency. I told them it wasn't decay. Nobody listened to me." Voss went very still. "What recall signal?" "Yours," the officer said, "or something close enough to it that our listening posts flagged the match immediately. We've been quietly rebuilding for far longer than your friends in that Concordat currently realize, Commander. Not because we particularly wanted a war with them." He looked at her with an expression she recognized uncomfortably well, the particular exhaustion of a soldier who had spent far too long holding a line for reasons that had long since stopped making any personal sense to him. "We rebuilt because we heard your ship's old frequency still active out there in the dark, and we assumed that meant the Terran fleet itself was rebuilding too. We spent 3 years preparing for an enemy that turned out to be a single ship and 38 tired souls." The revelation landed hard in the command briefing that followed. It meant the Ascendancy's aggression hadn't simply been opportunistic conquest, the way the Concordat had initially assumed. It had been driven, at least in significant part, by 3 years of quiet, escalating paranoia over a threat that had never actually existed in the shape they feared. An entire war nearly restarted by one old, half-decayed signal that nobody had bothered to properly investigate. "They attacked because they were afraid of us," Voss said quietly to Reyes, turning the intelligence over in her mind long after the briefing had officially ended. "Same as your Concordat nearly was before you decided to actually look instead of assuming. Same fear, different response." She shook her head slowly. "How many wars in this galaxy start exactly like that? Not malice, just fear left alone too long in the dark, finally deciding to strike first before it can be struck itself." Reyes didn't have an easy answer for that either, and the two of them sat together with the discomfort of it, in silence, for a considerable while. He did not sleep well in the nights that followed either, though almost no one aboard the delegation's flagship was ever told as much. It was his own aide, a woman who had served under 3 consecutive admirals and outlasted every scandal the Oversight Authority had weathered in that time, who later admitted, long after her own retirement, that she had found Reyes standing alone before the observation viewport on more than one of those nights, staring out at the drift's scattered debris field without speaking, as though trying to see all the way back through 3 centuries to the exact moment his own government had first decided silence was safer than the truth. "What troubles you, Admiral?" she had finally asked on the 3rd such night. Reyes had not turned around. "I built a career on the assumption that caution and safety were the same thing," came the answer, quiet enough that she'd had to strain to hear it over the low hum of the ship's systems. "Every officer before me believed exactly what I believed, and none of us ever once thought to ask what that caution actually cost the people we left behind in the dark." Not every voice in the Concordat shared Reyes's growing trust in what the Perseverance represented. Delegate Corwin Hale had spent his career building a political identity around caution regarding unregulated military technology, and he was not about to abandon that identity simply because a 300-year-old warship had turned out to be less monstrous than assumption had painted it. "You would have this body formally rearm a species we spent 3 centuries quietly agreeing was too dangerous to approach," he argued during a closed session Reyes attended only because his testimony had been formally requested. "A species whose own commander freely admits her people fought a war so total it required doctrine capable of grinding an enemy down through sheer, relentless attrition. We are not looking at a rescue here, Admiral. We are looking at the reopening of a door our predecessors sealed for very good reason." "Your predecessors sealed a door on people, Delegate," Reyes answered. "Not on a doctrine. There's a real difference between fearing what a species did once, under circumstances none of us has any right to judge from 3 centuries of comfortable distance, and assuming that's the only thing they will ever again be capable of." Hale was not persuaded that day, and his faction remained a quiet, simmering presence throughout everything that followed, never quite strong enough to force a reversal, but never entirely silent either, a persistent reminder that trust, once broken by history, rebuilds slowly even in the face of overwhelming good evidence. Myra Okonkwo felt the edge of that lingering distrust directly, 2 nights after her discovery became public knowledge across the concern's outer routes. She was cornered in a transit corridor near the survey station's docking bay by 2 men she didn't recognize, corporate security contractors by the look of their bearing, though they wore no visible insignia at all. "You found the ship nobody was supposed to find," the older of the 2 said, his tone pleasant in a way that made the words underneath it land considerably harder. "Some people would prefer that particular history stayed buried, given what it might mean for certain long-standing government contracts once the full story gets out." He let that hang in the air between them. "Careers get built on convenient silence, pilot," Yours could get quietly ended by inconvenient truth just as easily. Myra's mouth had gone dry, and she hadn't managed to form a response before Dask appeared from a side corridor with the particular unhurried timing of a man who had clearly been listening for longer than he'd let on. One weathered hand resting with obvious deliberateness on the comm unit clipped to his belt. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone almost conversational, "this dock's under active concerned security contract. I'd hate to have to file an incident report on a slow shift." The two men left without another word, and Myra didn't sleep well again for several nights after, but she also didn't stop showing up to the survey office each morning. And when Admiral Reyes eventually heard about the encounter secondhand, he made certain, quietly and without fanfare, that it never happened again. The formal ceremony took place 3 months later, in the same Concordat chamber where the very first delegate had once argued that humanity's mere existence was a threat worth debating. And Voss stood at its center in a dress uniform that had been mended so many times over 3 centuries that it was more patchwork than original fabric, and she refused every single offer to have it replaced. The chamber was fuller than Reyes had ever personally seen it. Delegates from worlds that had never previously bothered sending representatives to any prior session now crowded into the gallery, drawn by a story that had, in 3 short months, traveled further and faster than any piece of Concordat business in living memory. Voss stood at the center of it, flanked by Cade and Marsh in uniforms every bit as patched and imperfect as her own, and found herself thinking, almost absurdly, of the observation deck on the night she'd first taken command, the same unfamiliar stars, the same crushing weight of responsibility, except this time she wasn't carrying it entirely alone in the dark. She was carrying it in front of an entire sector that had finally, after 300 years, decided it was worth truly looking. The Concordat's ruling was unanimous this time, and entirely unambiguous. Full sovereign recognition of the Terran Defense Fleet's surviving representatives. A formal apology for 3 centuries of severed contact, though everyone in that chamber understood the apology couldn't possibly undo the 162 names in the Perseverance's own archive who had never woken from stasis to hear it. And an offer, extraordinary by any historical standard, of a full survey mission to the sealed coordinates of Sol, with complete Concordat resources committed, to finally determine what had actually become of humanity's homeworld after 3 centuries of enforced, deliberate silence. Voss had asked for that last part herself, the night before, sitting quietly with Reyes in the Perseverance's cramped observation deck. "You don't have to go looking," Reyes had said gently. "Whatever's there or isn't won't change what your crew already survived." "I know," Voss said, "but Cade asked me last week whether he'd ever actually get to see Earth, not the archives, not the fragmented histories, the actual sky." She looked out at the unfamiliar stars, the same view she'd been quietly searching for meaning in since the day Reyes' shuttle first found them. 300 years we held a line for a home none of us ever actually got to see. I'm done holding lines for ghosts, Admiral. I want to know, finally, what we're actually standing on. The survey mission to Sol departed 8 months after that ceremony, a joint expedition crewed by both the Perseverance and a dedicated Concordat science vessel, escorted, at Voss's own explicit insistence, by nothing more than a single unarmed shuttle. A deliberate statement that this was an act of long-delayed homecoming rather than any kind of veiled reconquest. Voss stood on the observation deck as the ship finally dropped out of transit at the edge of a system sealed for 3 centuries, and for the first time since her own revival on a bridge full of complete strangers, found herself entirely unable to keep her composure fully steady. What they found there was neither the total ruin the archive's darkest projections had prepared them for, nor the pristine, untouched homeworld some of the crew had allowed themselves to quietly, secretly hope for. It was something in between, a planet visibly scarred by the final years of a war fought largely among its own scattered survivors, cities slowly rebuilt in fits and starts by descendants of those who had simply never left, who had spent 300 years believing themselves entirely, permanently alone in the galaxy, cut off from every colony, every fleet, every last fragment of the Terran defense fleet that had once stretched across a dozen contested systems. They had survived, quietly, stubbornly, without any of the rigid doctrine or brutal discipline that had shaped the Perseverance's own 3 centuries of endless waiting, but they had survived nonetheless. And when the ship's beacon finally broadcast its old identification codes into an atmosphere that hadn't heard them in 300 years, the response that came back was not fear, and it was not disbelief. It was relief so overwhelming and so total that half the bridge crew had to leave the room entirely before they could compose themselves enough to answer it properly. Cade was among the very first to set foot on the surface, 3 weeks later, standing in an open field beneath a sky he had spent his entire life trying and consistently failing to imagine correctly. He didn't say anything at all for a long time. He simply stood there, letting an actual wind move through grass that had never once grown anywhere near the recycled corridors of the only home he had ever personally known. And when Voss finally found him there an hour later, he was crying in the particular, quiet way of someone who had finally been allowed to feel something he'd spent his entire life being carefully trained not to. "It's not what I pictured," Cade admitted. "No," Voss agreed, looking out at the same unfamiliar, achingly familiar horizon spread before them both. "It's better. It's actually real." There was a quieter moment, 3 weeks after the formal ceremony but well before the Sol mission departed, that never once made it into any official record, though Voss thought about it often in the years that eventually followed. She had gone alone to the observation deck late into the ship's artificial night cycle, and found Marsh already there, sitting cross-legged on the deck plating with a data pad full of navigational charts for the upcoming Sol survey spread carefully across her knees. "Couldn't sleep either," Voss Sked, settling down beside her without preamble. "I keep trying to imagine it," Marsh admitted. "Earth, I've read every single description in the archive 100 times over, and I still can't quite picture it correctly." She looked up. "Do you remember it, actually remember it, and not simply from the records?" Voss was quiet for a long moment. "I remember the smell of rain right before it actually falls," she said finally. "I remember that much clearly. Everything else feels like it belongs to someone else's memory by now." She reached over and gently closed the data pad. "We'll get there, and whatever we find, you'll finally get to build your own memory of it instead of simply borrowing mine." Marsh didn't answer right away. When she finally did speak, her voice carried something Voss hadn't quite heard from her before, not fear, not grief, just quiet, steady anticipation. "I'd like that," she said. "A memory that's actually finally mine." The Perseverance did not stand down after the ceremony concluded. Voss made that particular choice deliberately, formally, with the full weight of her newly restored authority behind it, not because the war she had once fought had somehow returned, but because she had come to understand something important in the months since Reyes' shuttle had first hailed her ship. A warship didn't have to remain actively at war in order to still matter. Sometimes it simply had to keep watching. She stood on the bridge as the ship's own beacon reconfigured for the first time in 300 years. No longer a distress signal, no longer a restricted identification broadcasting quietly into empty silence, but an open, formal declaration transmitted across every single frequency the Concordats networks could reliably carry. TIDS Perseverance, Terran Defense Fleet Long Patrol Designation, watch concluded, humanity has returned. Cade, standing at his station, allowed himself a smile Voss hadn't seen from him since before any of this entire ordeal had even begun. Not relief exactly, but something steadier underneath it. Something that looked, for the very first time in the young lieutenant's entire life, like the simple, ordinary hope of finally getting to see what came next. Voss watched the stars ahead of her ship, unfamiliar still, but no longer only a place to hold a defensive line against. A place, perhaps, to finally build something genuinely worth defending instead. The last human warship had come home at last. It simply turned out that home was wherever they finally, collectively decided to make it. And for the first time in 300 years, that decision belonged entirely, completely to them. Years later, when the Sol survey mission's full findings had finally been compiled, catalogued, and quietly folded into the official historical record of a dozen worlds, Admiral Reyes would still tell the story of that very first contact. The 7 agonizing hours of silence before Danica Voss's voice finally crackled across an open channel and demanded, with absolutely no fear in it at all, that an unidentified vessel identify itself or be fired upon. He would tell it not primarily as a war story, though it had certainly begun as one, and not simply as a diplomatic triumph, though it had eventually become that as well. He told it instead as a story about the particular, stubborn shape of loyalty, about a crew who kept a promise nobody was left alive to formally release them from, generation after generation, in the freezing dark at the very edge of a war that had already ended entirely without them, simply because somebody, a very long time ago, had told them to hold the line, and absolutely nobody had ever thought to tell them they were finally allowed to stop. That, Reyes liked to say, was the part every history always seemed to get wrong about humanity. Not the weapons, not the war itself. The waiting. 3 full centuries of it, silent and utterly unbroken, until the day someone finally came looking and found them still standing there, steady, unafraid, and exactly where they had always been left.